everybody, we are back with another video for you today. Today's deck profile is going to be a little bit different than our usual. As you can see, the cards are all laid out for you, and we're going to be talking about Xros Heart today. Since Xros has been around since BT10, I just figured we're not going to do a full in-depth breakdown of ratios and cards just because most players by now know what Xros does, know what the mechanics are like, and know what each card does. So I just felt like it'd be a little bit redundant going into an in-depth breakdown of the cards because, everybody would already know what they're about. What I really wanted to focus on with this video was why I think Xros is still a very viable strat. In today's meta, I think moving forward into RB1, BT14, it's still going to be pretty competitive in my opinion and pretty viable. And I wanted to talk about why I feel that's the case. For the newer players, I will have a thumbnail of the cards as I do a very, very brief overview of the deck. So feel free to pause the video and just read what the cards do. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments section below. I'll be happy to respond as best I can to them. But like I said, I really wanted this video to focus more so on why I think Xros is still a very strong and very competitive deck, and why I think it's something to not be slept on. And before I move any further, I just wanted to give a quick shout out to my buddies Wilson and Shamoon. You guys have been, sort of my go-to digi bros, if you want to put it that way. They've really introduced me to Xros Heart as a deck, and really showed me how fun it was to pilot. They both have topped big events, Shamoon at Nationals and Wilson getting top 8 at a Regionals. So hopefully one day I can follow in your guys' footsteps and take Xros to a pretty good showing. So just a shout out to you guys. I really enjoy this deck. It's probably my favorite deck in the entire card game at this point. So really just have a hell of a time playing it and wanted to share with y'all. So without further ado, just a very quick overview of the deck. It's a pretty standard Xros Heart deck. Your eggs, you're running the Pikmon for your draw engine. Your rookies, 4 Shoutmon, 4 Sparrow, 4 Star. Shaman being sort of a basic searcher, gives you Rush. Sparrow gives you Reboot, and Starmons gives you the draw power once again. You really want to be chipping away with your lower end body so that draw power and search is helpful. You're drawing a whole lot with this deck, so you really are not lacking for ways of getting your pieces. We threw in one King version just because King version for game can be a thing, being able to bring up a Shoutmon from your trash and just go, okay, we're going to rush with King version. It can close out games at times. Other level 4s we're running are the standard Darulu and the Ballista for your cross pieces. Like Shout, Darulu, and Ballista are your heart and soul of the deck, so to speak. So I think you max those out. I run 3x3, again, for cycle and draw power. You can pick up 2 pieces with X3, including a Blue Flare, which ties in with our Z Greymon. X4 was limited for a reason. It's just so good for draw 2 and restanding Tamers, so you have to run X4. X5 and X7 was something I was playing around with here. I used to run 3 of X5 and only 2 of the X7, hence why there's only 2 alt arts of X7. I'm working on getting the 3rd one. But now I think in today's meta, with how reliant decks are on big stacks and sort of a combo play, throwing down an X7 to delete a stack or delete a body can really disrupt that. And I felt like that, for me, was a lot more helpful and a lot more viable in today's meta than just, say, X5. Being a blocker and check +1 is helpful, but I just felt like being able to disrupt their plays with deletion was much, much more helpful from X7 standpoint, which is why I bumped X7 up to 3. Because of X7, you're running 2 Z Greymon, 2 Omni Shoutmon. Omni Shout has come in very clutch with the check +1, and also just hard digivolving it to delete a body can also be a viable strategy. I run 1 X7 superior mode. I'll be honest with you, I've never actually procced it. I've never actually done the X7 play, which, I still think is a very good removal play. As a lat stitch removal, this can be very helpful. I just personally have never procced it off. Tamers, we're running sort of the standard Taiki, Zenjiro, Akari. So 4 Taiki, 3 Zen, 3 Akari. Again, sort of bread and butter Xros Heart. The triple tamer is something that I see as more viable in today's format. I think maybe in like the BT11, BT12 format, maybe not so much because of how fast decks were. So playing this tamer down for 4 sometimes felt bad. But I feel like nowadays, with how some boards need to be set up or how combo plays need to be set up, you have time to play the triple tamer, and it gives you a lot of value. Being able to slot something to gain a memory, to draw a card is very, very helpful. And then also being another Digicross target because, there are times where you don't see Taiki, right? And that was very hurtful for me when I played the Mervamon package for this, where I had a lot of Digicross materials under my tamers, just no Taiki, so I couldn't Digicross. The triple tamer gives you that additional target to say, look, we're going to Digicross from our tamers. So I think that is also another benefit to this card. And then to round out the deck, options, Sunrise Buster and Heaven's Judgment. Sunrise is just great because you can DP neg big bodies and throw out another tamer. Last night I was able to, Sunrise a Quartzmon and get rid of Hunter's sources and really saved my butt during that game. And then Heaven's Judgment is expensive, but I think a very interesting choice in this deck just because you run so many different colors that you can really do a whole lot of damage to wide boards, to big bodies, whatnot. So I think a very toolboxy option and a very toolboxy deck. So I really like it for that. I think you can make a case to say, Lonky versus Crimson. Crimson is a cheaper option to play that is very helpful in today's meta. But I personally just like, if I can't get rid of a body, then I feel like Heaven's Judgment is very helpful. Because as you can see, there aren't a lot of removal options in this deck outside of X7 and superior mode. So giving yourself more ability and more resources to remove, I just felt personally is very helpful to this deck and keeps it viable. So without further ado, let's move into a more nuanced discussion about what Xros Heart does, what it like matches up to in the meta, and why I think it's still very good. All right, everybody. So here's just a brief summary of what we're going to be talking about. Like I said, we'll be discussing what makes Xros good. We'll be taking a look at some of the matchups it has into the big hitters of today's meta. And then we'll wrap up with some concluding thoughts towards the end. So Xros is a deck that is very low to the ground. It wants to go fast and it wants to go aggressive. But the one thing that I think sets it apart from a lot of today's decks is consistency. Xros is a deck that can really just hit you hard right out of the gate. Like, you can get going immediately. Some of the decks today take some time to build. It takes time to find your pieces. It takes time to find your line to do that big wombo combo play that you're looking for. Xros, on the other hand, lets you set the tempo very, very early. If you can get out a rookie in the back, spit out a Taiki, look for your pieces, cycle through your deck, you're doing so much with so little, and you're able to really chip them down real fast. And I think that's what, in my opinion, keeps this deck very viable. And, it is a very toolboxy deck, so it's very reactive. You can kind of play it multiple ways. Sort of like I said, a lot of these decks have one wombo combo play as their win con, whereas Xros really doesn't have that, like, ooh, here's this OTK play that we do. We don't have that. We have different ways to play the deck depending on the matchup, depending on the board state, and depending on the situation, which I think gives it that flexibility to say, okay, well, if this avenue is not possible, we have another avenue that we can explore. We have another way that we can go about playing this deck, and you don't shut yourself out because you don't have this one piece. And I really like that about this deck, because at the end of the day, the decks that are the most consistent, the decks that are the most reliable, are the decks that are going to do well for you in these big tournaments, whether it's a store championship at locals, whether it's regionals and whatever. I think consistency is key, and I think Xros gives you that. It's not immune to bricking. Don't get me wrong. It will brick, and there are hands that you're like, ooh, how do I get out of this? but more often than not, you can find ways to get out of it. And that's what I love about this deck. So going into today's meta, and looking at some of these major matchups that you'll see in, regionals, locals, whatever it may be, we're going to be looking first into the OTK decks, right? The big ones being Shine Greymon and Mirage Galgamon. I think even more emphasis now on you gotta go fast, right? You really want to be able to hit them for lethal before they can get their combo play off, because more often than not, these decks are built in a way where if they can get that combo play off, there's really not a whole lot stopping them, regardless of the deck, Unless you have a big option that stops them, more often than not, they're gonna get by. And with Cross being a very Digimon and Tamer heavy deck, there's not a lot in your security that will typically stop these decks. So you really want to be able to hit them before they hit you. You do want to read their board state, however. I think this very much is a comment for Shine Greymon, where, if you're seeing that they're looking for that Tamer, like they're searching and they haven't played a Marcus out yet, or they haven't done that Marcus like Geogray play where they play out a Marcus for free, that they're missing a Tamer. Sometimes you don't want to be super aggressive swinging in security, because if you give them that Marcus, now you've given them that avenue to do what they want to do, right? So sometimes if I see that, I'll be like, okay, you know what? Maybe it's better to just build maybe a wider board so that when I am able to swing, I'm swinging for lethal at that time. I'm not giving them that chance to, if I do hit a Marcus, respond to it. Or I just force them to say, look, if you need that Marcus, you're playing it. I'm not giving it to you, right? So sometimes you have to read the board state that way and read what they're doing. But because you're so aggressive early and you have that tempo, you are sometimes able to just force them to make the suboptimal play, right? Usually both decks will tend to stay in raising until they can pull off that, wombo play. Sometimes with how aggressive you are, you're forcing them to come out early and make a suboptimal play. And I think that really screws up their game plan, because sometimes they're raising too early and then they're dealing with your board, quote unquote, but now they're not able to do what they wanted to do. I think that can work in your favor at times. So I think being able to do that really messes up their OTK potential. I've had a pretty good time playing against both of these decks, whether it be Mirage, whether it be Shine Greymon, mainly because I'm faster than they are. I'm able to get into their security, force them to do something, like I said, and I'm able to deal with it. X7 has been huge in this meta, mainly because by playing X7, I pop their stack, they don't have protection, and they're sort of forced to rebuild again. So I think you can do so much with Cross against these OTK decks. Next deck that we see a lot of now is Hunters, right? And I think, like, the slide is saying, you want to become the predator before you become hunted. This matchup is truly a toss-up for me. I think if Hunters draws hot, there's not a whole lot you can do. If they're able to see their Tamers, get out their pieces early, get into a superior mode and tuck your pieces away, you're in a pretty difficult situation, because superior mode will be swinging. Sometimes it'll have check +1, sometimes it'll have jamming. You're in a pretty difficult scenario in that way, and you're really on the back foot, which is where you don't want to be with this deck. You really want to be on the front foot. So I think it really depends on who sees their pieces first. If Hunters is struggling to find their Tamers or struggling to find their superior modes, you have a field day with the deck, because their security is typically very low to the ground too, so you're not afraid to swing into security. You're able to chip. Similar to what I said with Shine Greymon, though, you do want to be careful, because if you swing into security and hit a bunch of their Tamers, now you've given them the gas to cook. But I do think you have to read their board state and see before you make that judgment call. X7 and X7 superior mode can be pretty good lifelines for you as well, if you're able to kind of clear their board or their stack, such as a superior mode or a Quartzmon, for example. You can use X7 to do that. Sunrise Buster for me last night, like I said, was pretty clutch in clearing out their big stack. What is helpful is that if you do end up clearing their stack, clearing their Arrestor Dramon Superior or even their Quartzmon, they lose all their sources because those bodies do not save. So sometimes if you're able to clear out that big body, you gain so much momentum because now they have to rebuild. I think BT11 Shoutmon or Omni Shoutmon also is a sleeper pick. I say this because it's treated as a Shoutmon, as a Digicross. So you can cross into like an X3 with this Omni Shout, or even an X5, right? And yeah, you don't get rushed that turn, but if you pass turn with that Digicross, you have a body now that's swinging for 2 checks. And it's a direct response to their Watchmaker play, where they're able to give something +1 security check. So if you can guarantee that body will stay alive next turn, you get 2 checks out of it, right? And they sort of are forced to deal with it. Otherwise, you're going to be able to swing again for 2 checks and really damage them that way. So I think BT11 Omni Shout can be utilized in a more cheeky way and not just into that X7 cross. Utilize it and use it for like early aggression. You know, I really like that extra +1 check, that it can give. Royal Knights is another deck that we should talk about. I've seen some decks in JP format going into EX5 where Royal Knights is still doing some things. I'm surprised by that, in all honesty. I don't know if that's going to translate into our format here in America. But I think regardless, we'll still be seeing Royal Knights through BT13, probably a little bit into BT14 as well. So it'd be good to know how to play against it. You really want to memory choke them. Royal Knights as a deck is a ticking time bomb. Once they get into what they want to do, it's pretty much GG's, right? For any deck, because you've got 6, 7 big bodies out that are just swinging. So you really want to beat them to the punch. So again, what Cross does, it's low to the ground, it's fast, it sets the tempo out early. You want to be able to do that with this deck. Don't be shy with your X7 play. Even if it gives them 3 or 4 memory, that's okay. Even if you're digicrossing and it's not an optimal X7, that is okay. Because if you pop one of their bodies, that slows them down, right? Because more often than not, the Royal Knights bodies won't be swinging. They're just going to be on-played, and they're going to get tugged into, Yggdrasil after. So if you can pop them, it gives them 1 less body to tuck under and 1 less thing that you have to worry about. And it buys you another turn. So if you can X7 early and just pop a body, I say go for it, And then another thing you want to do is if you're anticipating an Omni play in like 1 or 2 turns and you know that you're not going to be able to go for lethal, try to get your blockers out. I know they have ways to deal with your blockers, so sometimes those plays aren't as effective, but you kind of have to force them to make that decision, right? So you try to get your blockers out to just stall, and hopefully buy yourself another turn. But like I said, your best bet is to just beat them to the punch and try to get to them before they get to you. And you do that best by memory choking. Other decks to talk about that I'm not really going to spend a whole lot of time on just for sake of time in this video is, decks like Blue Flare. I think you have a pretty decent matchup, but you want to be careful because you do have a tendency to spit out bodies with your tamers. So you don't want to give them that 2 Digimon on field to kind of spur on their win con effects with. So be careful with that. But I think otherwise, you're doing a lot of things well against Blue Flare. You can do single pokes. I'd say set up your tamers early, and then really just beat them to the punch later. But I think overall, Blue Flare is a pretty decent matchup. It just sometimes you will struggle because you have a tendency to put out bodies out on board. But I think overall you have a pretty good matchup. Bloomlord as well, I think you have to beat them to the punch, but you do have ways of dealing with their board. If They have a lot of suspended lower DP guys out. You have multiple ways to deal with it. Darulu pops anything 3k or less, which is a majority of their little guys. And a lot of your cross pieces with Ballista will pierce through them too. So you're able to control and delete while still getting security checks out. So I still think Bloom is a decent matchup. If they get into Quartz, it can be a little bit tricky. But I think if you're able to beat them to the punch and just go faster than they do, you're in a pretty good spot. Red Hybrid is another one you just sort of have to outpace. Another thing Red Hybrid will struggle against is getting your blockers out. So getting your Ballistas, your X7 with Ziegs underneath, or your X5s, they struggle against that because they really don't have a way of popping blockers unless you go into their top end. And more often than not, Red Hybrid is a deck that wants to just check quickly with their lower bodies. So by having blockers out on board, you stop that, and then they lose their when digivolving effects and whatnot. So, and when attacking event effects too. So I think getting your blockers out on board with Red Hybrid is going to be more essential than most decks. And then after you do that, you can just go ahead and do cross things and just swing and get away at their security. Belphemon I think is a little bit of a difficult matchup too, because sometimes they're able to just negate attacks, they're able to pop boards, pop your board with rage mode, and sometimes they just do Belphemon things and swing 2 checks, resand, and do what it wants to do. But I think regardless, right, if they give you a lot of memory, you're okay with that. You're able to play out your tamers, build up your board, and find multiple ways to swing. Belphemon can negate attacks, but it can only do that once. So if you're able to get early aggression in, and then they go into an expensive Belphemon, sometimes you don't care, right? You're able to just keep swinging and do your plays where sometimes they just can't keep up. So I think Belphemon overall is a decent matchup. I think you want to go fast, go quick, and kind of set the tempo and force them to make a play, as opposed to being on the back foot. But I think if you're able to draw hot, Belphemon's not a bad matchup by any means. You're able to do very well against it, I think. Weaknesses to the deck, obviously Tamer hate decks like Black War Grey, War Greymon, you struggle. Hades Force is pretty much a death sentence. It's really fucking difficult to play out against the Hades Force as Xros Heart. It feels bad. When you see Hades and you see all your Tamers get deleted, you're in a pretty bad spot. There are times where I've been able to play out of it and rebuild and still do it, but it's really difficult. I think the mantra of that is just to try to go as fast as you can, against Black War, because they will still take time to set up. Red decks, War Grey decks are powerful but slow, and if you can outpace them, then you're living fine. Machine Dramon's also another difficult matchup, strictly because of just redirect and blockers. You aren't really able to get your checks in because Machine Dramon with an analog man can redirect so many times and strip sources and negate attacks. So there's just so many things that it can do to stunt your sort of chip plays. So I think Machine Dramon is a rough matchup for you. Alphamon can be tricky. It's not impossible, because again, Alphamon takes time to set up. So if you can go faster than it, you can do very well. But I think once Alpha does Alpha things, right, goes into Oryuken and swings for that explosive play, there's not a whole lot your deck will be able to do against Oryuken. And on that note too, if they Congo you, well, you're also kind of sitting in hot water because, well, Congo stops all of your bodies from attacking outside of like X4 and X7, X5, and at that point, you sort of limit yourself to what you can do. Your best bet would be to try to just get rid of Oryuken, but with Oryuken being like 16, 17k, that's also a very difficult ask. So I think Alpha can be tricky. You just have to outpace it, and if it can't close out games, then you're still sort of in a pretty decent spot. So it's a tough matchup, but not an impossible one. I think your absolute worst matchup is the decks that have Tamer hate, such as Black War Gray or Greymon, and whatnot. But yeah, some closing thoughts, some personal reflections from just playing this deck a whole lot. I think your starting hand ideally should have a Tamer. If you see your initial hand and it has no Tamer, automatic mulligan. Just automatic mulligan. You always want to have a Tamer in your hand. Ideally you start out with a Taiki or a triple Tamer, but honestly any Tamer is fine for me. You want to play out the triple Tamer probably earlier rather than later. If you can get the triple Tamer out like turn 2 or 3, that's ideal, because any later than that you sort of lose tempo and you're passing turn with it, which can be pretty fatal. But, a turn 2 or 3 triple Tamer with an early Taiki is, I think, best case scenario. But like I said, any hand with a Tamer is fine. Also remember that crossing is a choice. You don't always have to digicross for everything, right? And what I mean by that is that if you are in a spot where if you do the full X3 play, right, with Darulu, Ballista, and Shoutmon, and you go to 0, now you've sort of dedicated yourself to giving them 2, 3, possibly 4 memory. Sometimes you don't want to do that, right? If you say, look, I'm not going to swing, I'm just going to cross with Ballista and Darulu, you're going to choke them to 1 if they don't have a memory Tamer, and you get to do your reveal top 3, pick up 2. That's a play that you should be doing, right? You want to be mindful of your crossing, and you want to be able to manipulate your memory that way. You want to be able to also finagle it so that your opponent is out-resourced by you and your plays. Also know that looking at your hand and looking at your Tamers, knowing what is important to cross with. Sometimes getting lost in the sauce and crossing into like an X5 for the full thing or the full stack, you swing, you do your checks, great, but now you're like, well, now I don't have any more shouts or ballistas and I'm in a bad spot next turn. So sometimes being mindful of that is also very, very important for this deck, and I think what makes a good pilot from a great pilot is knowing when to cross and what materials you have, what materials you're missing, so that your future plays aren't clunky and cumbersome. On that note, be careful of what you're cycling and drawing. I mean, this is a piece of advice not just for this deck, but for all decks in general. But I think you really want to be mindful of what you're drawing into and what you can anticipate being hit off of another surge or being hit off of a Taiki play or whatever, because sometimes that is important. You really want to be reading and counting what you're drawing and what's coming through so you can anticipate what may be insecurity, what may be coming up in your next search, so that you can play out and time out your plays accordingly. And last tidbit would be, particularly for this meta, get your blockers out and try to pop things early. Force your opponent to raise out early and then pop them with an X7 and just really disrupt their combo plays. And I think you'll be fine. Like I said, this deck is really, really toolboxy. You can do a whole lot of different things with this deck, and you can really do, multiple plays, and you can try to find a way to win in different scenarios in multiple different ways. There's no one right way to play this deck, and that's what I love about it. You can do so much with it, and you can really express yourself in many different ways with this deck. And I learn so much more about this deck every time I play it. So that leads me into this last part of just have fun, guys. We talk a lot about, strategy and optimizing plays and, what's the best deck to play or what's the best ratio to play. And, we talk a lot about the competitive scene, but honestly, guys, this is a hobby, right? This is something that we all come together for to have fun, and have fun with it. Have fun playing this deck, any deck that you're playing. Remember that this is just about having fun and having a good time. So this is the deck that does it for me, and I just want to remind you guys as well. So that really wraps up the video. Like I said, a little bit of a different format today, but let me know what you guys think. Let me know what you guys feel about Xros Heart. Let me know what you thought about my take on this. And like I said, we appreciate all the support we've been getting. Don't forget to, if you have any questions about what I had to say, feel free to leave a comment, and we'll see you on the next one. Thanks, guys.